Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues. So, we are continuing our discussion of metaethics and what is moral philosophy and a few of the fundamentals of it with a discussion of moral objectivism and relativism today, where we try and tackle the question of whether or not moral questions actually have right answers. So, what we're going to do is hit an overview of this sort of problem, and then we're going to look at three major positions and some of their strengths and weaknesses about whether or not there really are answers to these kinds of problems. And then we're going to end with a bit of a provisional answer that'll help us to move forward through the rest of the semester. So, to start off, it's worth taking a moment to clarify what this topic actually is. Uh, One way of phrasing it is, are there right answers to moral questions? That is there actually one particular answer to moral problems that we consider to be uh, the right answer, the correct answer, the one that accurately describes the world? Put another way that's a little more precise, we might also ask, are there such things as moral facts? And we know that there are facts of all sorts of different kinds. There are facts about the way the world is, there are physical facts, there are mathematical facts, there are psychological facts. There are facts about what human beings are like. And all of these things are facts in virtue of the fact that they describe the way that the world is. They describe something about the way reality actually is at this moment in time and in this particular place. So when we ask whether or not there are such things as moral facts, we're asking whether or not there are universal, objective facts and principles that apply whether or not people believe in them. And we need an answer to this kind of question before we can answer most of the other ones that we deal with in this semester. Like if we dig into questions of equality, for example, asking how should we respond to racial and sexual and gender inequality? What should be our response to that sort of thing? How should we handle those types of problems and those kinds of discrepancies between how people are treated? If there isn't an actual right answer to that, then really we're just sharing our opinions on the stuff, and there's no real way to move forward. There's no real such thing as moving forward on it. It's something like identifying whether or not pineapple on pizza is delicious, which it is. And I will fail you if you disagree. Kidding. Kidding. I never grade based on what your opinion is in this class. But questions like whether or not pineapple is tasty on pizza is something of a matter of taste. It's just a matter of opinion. There is no real right answer to it. It's like asking whether or not the color purple is pretty. Some people are going to think so, some people aren't, but there's no real fact of the matter. We want to know whether or not that's the case with moral questions, because if there is no fact of the matter, then we're just having discussions about the moral problems that we engage with, but there's no real solution to them. But if there is such an answer, well, then we need to know that there is so that we can know to work towards that solution. And the kinds of things that we're looking for are whether or not there are objective answers to this, not just like right in the sense of I approve it or my culture approves it or something like that. We want to know whether reality actually has a particular way that moral things are, just in the way that reality has certain ways that physical objects are, or that mathematical relations are. We want to know whether or not there are moral facts in the same way that there are mathematical facts, or the same way that there are physical facts. Things that exist regardless of whether you believe them or not, things that you can be right and wrong about, statements that can be true and false. So we need to know an answer to all of this in order to move forward with all the stuff that we do. Now, there are a few different possible answers to this kind of problem, which we can broadly split into the realist and the anti-realist categories. Realist answers say that there are some kind of moral facts, where the anti-realists don't. We can think of the two positions as being labeled as saying whether or not moral facts are real or not. But it's worth noting that these are very, very large umbrellas, that there are a lot of different views underneath. There's a lot of varieties of moral realist views, as well as many different anti-realist views. And it's also worth noting that while realists generally will answer yes to the question of whether or not there are moral facts, they may not be the same kind of facts as mathematics or physics. They are maybe facts, but they may be non objective facts. So, this is something worth digging into. Now, the most straightforward answer on the realist side of this sort of divide is what we can call moral objectivism. And just as the name sort of implies, this is the view that morality is objective in the same way that math is, or the same way that physics is, or the same way that geography is. Uh, when we talk about a moral fact being objective, we mean that there are rules and principles that apply to everyone, whether or not they believe in them. And it's something that you can be mistaken about. And this is the main and most popular version of moral realism. And it's worth noting that there is no single moral objectivism. There's a lot of varieties of this, just like there are a lot of different varieties of realism. Objectivism, for one, comes in several different flavors. Some versions of objectivism we're going to argue for what we might call absolutism. That is, that a rule applies all of the time without exceptions. Something like a moral absolutist would agree that it's wrong to kill someone, but that means that self defense is also not okay. A moral absolutist will say, this rule or this principle applies in every situation, no matter what. Other moral objectivists would disagree with that. They might argue for something closer to particularism, which says that there are different rules for different situations, and there are even some extreme versions of it that say, yes, there are right answers to moral problems, but there are no moral principles or rules that we can use across different situations. And then there's going to be some versions that offer consequentialist theories, some non consequentialist theories. So moral objectivism is a big umbrella to put things under. And it does not automatically mean that absolutism is true. But the thing that does unite all the different versions of realism is this singular notion that regardless of what people think, some things are right and wrong. That is, just like there are facts in the world about what the physical world is like, and nobody has to believe them for them to be true, that's the way objectivists treat morality. Like, take the simple fact that water is composed of one molecule of water is composed of one molecule of oxygen and a molecule of oxygen, one atom of oxygen and two atoms of hydrogen. Even before anybody knew anything about hydrogen and oxygen, it was true that the chemical formula of water is H2O, that those three atoms come together to form one molecule of water. Nobody needed to believe it for that to be true. And in fact, for ages and ages, people would have disagreed with that. They would have treated water as a singular, indivisible element, something that has no parts. And they would have been wrong about all of that. And we say that about these ancient views of physics and the way the world works. Objectivists think that morality works in the same way. Objectivists think that there are actual facts about morality that just are or aren't true, regardless of what people think about them. Uh, and so, really, the moral objectivist looks at a position that sort of just applies consistency across a lot of different kinds of facts. They say that yes, there are moral facts, and in the same way that there are facts about mathematics, there are facts about physics, there are facts about human psychology and the way that people act, there are facts about what you should do, and there's just simply no difference between them. But this view does have its own pile of issues. For one, there's a set of questions that objectivism does not easily answer. And so it's usually a more complicated element of the theory that they have to be able to address these. And these are questions like, well, where do these standards and rules come from? How do we know which ones are correct? Which ones are correct? Because a lot of different people think that their views are objectively true. Take, for example, evangelical Protestant Christians. They've got particular views of morality, and like even say particularly sexual morality, or views about abortion, or about how a government should be structured. And they believe that they have the objective truth of the matter. They believe that their view is correct and everyone else is mistaken. This is a version of moral objectivism. But we also have people with radically different worldviews and radically different views of ethics who would disagree, but yet still consider themselves to have the objective truth. So there's the question of who's right? Which standards should we be following? These are questions that an objectivist has to answer in order to have the view really work. And this is one of the main detractions against moral objectivism. Now, moral relativism, by contrast, states that there are such things as moral facts. That is, there are facts about what's right and wrong, but they don't have to answer these same sorts of questions, or at least not in the same way. Moral relativism is the position that moral facts depend on what people think at either the level of whole cultures or individuals. In other words, there are moral facts, but they are mind dependent things. They depend on what people believe about morality. So some things actually are right or wrong, normal or abnormal, but it's the belief about that that makes it that way. And so we might have two different groups who believe very different things about morality. And it's true, true that certain things are right for one group and that they're wrong for another group. Uh, and both of those are true at the same time. And so what we might say is that whatever given thing we're talking about, X, let's say, that X is right for them, that it's based on their views and opinions that it is actually the case. And this is, for a lot of people, a very common and appealing view, particularly among our generation, millennials and post-millennials. My wife, for example, is a moral relativist. But there is no singular moral relativism. There are a few different flavors to it that are worth talking about. So the two main ones that we'll focus on are what we'll call subjective relativism, or just subjectivism, and cultural relativism. Now, subjectivists argue that moral facts are relative to what individual people believe. That is, what's moral and right is different depending on who you're talking to or who you're talking about. Um, Subjective relativism would argue something like, well, it's wrong to kill somebody if you yourself believe that it's wrong. Your belief is what gives rise to that moral fact. It's not an objective fact. It's not independent of your beliefs and your opinions. But instead, you have this fact that arises from your beliefs. Now, cultural relativists argue something similar, but rather than being based on your individual beliefs, cultural relativists argue that moral facts depend on the culture and the beliefs of where you come from, or depending on the version of this sort of view, where you're currently at or what society you're part of. So here, there are, again, actual facts about what's right and wrong. There is an answer to moral questions. But that answer depends on what your culture believes about these different things. And again, this isn't just what people think is right or wrong. Instead, we're talking about what actually is right or wrong, and simply pointing out that according to this sort of view, what actually is right or wrong is based on what people think. What people think about different issues affects or changes what actually is right or wrong for them. So here, if we want to get another example, a cultural relativist would say that, well, it's wrong to kill somebody if your culture believes that it's wrong. And if you come from a culture that uh, believes that killing is immoral, then it actually is for you. And you've committed some sort of wrong action if you do that sort of thing. And like I said, this view is definitely appealing for a lot of people. But despite its appeal, relativism does have some issues, just like objectivism does. For one, the subjective version of relativism has a few implications that really give us good reason to question it and perhaps reject it. For one, subjective relativism seems to imply that we cannot be wrong about moral questions and problems, that we are morally infallible. And the way that sort of implication works is that if what's right or wrong for me to do is based on what I think, what I believe is right or wrong, then it seems like I can't actually be mistaken about moral facts. If I believe it's perfectly fine to murder this nice old lady on a park bench, then it is, just because I believed it. I can't be mistaken about that. So long as I actually believe that whatever I'm doing is right or wrong, it is. And that just seems deeply mistaken as far as our experience of being human and being moral. Again, we might look back to our criteria for a moral theory and say that, well, wait a minute, this clashes with my experience of morality. There are times when I've been wrong about moral facts and principles. I've made mistakes in my life, moral mistakes. And if that's the case, subjectivism doesn't fit well with that, which gives us a perhaps a strong reason to reject moral subjectivism. Similarly, subjective relativism has a hard time explaining moral disagreement. Excuse me. Take two people, say Adam and Sophia, and let's say that each of these two people have different opinions about animal rights. Let's say that Adam believes that dogs and cats should have the same rights as people, and Sophia disagrees. Now, if subjective relativism is true, because remember, this is a theory, this is an explanation of what's going on morally in all of this, not just a perspective. If subjective relativism is actually true, then both Adam and Sophia are correct. Adam's right that dogs and cats should have the same rights as people, and Sophia's right in saying that they shouldn't. And that seems weird. Normally, things cannot be contradictory in the world. It's impossible for a computer to be both on and off at the same time in the same way. It's impossible for you to be in two places at once. The universe does not allow contradictions in a logical sense, where two entirely opposite things are true at the same time, in the same place, in the same way, and so on. So, subjective relativism seems to say that if two people disagree, they're both right, and that's perfectly fine. There is no clash to that. There is no real disagreement going on. It's hard to determine what's actually happening when two different people disagree on subjective relativism. And again, this seems to give us a reason to reject it. But even if we reject subjective relativism, cultural relativism doesn't seem to do a whole lot better. Most of the same worries still apply, because cultural relativism takes the same picture that moral facts depend on beliefs and opinion and simply raises it to the level of culture. So if we look at the couple of worries, we might worry about something about our cultures being morally infallible according to cultural relativism. If cultural relativism is true, then whatever our culture thinks is correct, which seems to imply very odd things. If, say, for example, you know your World War II history, or you care a whole lot about civil rights. The 1950s United States was not a friendly place for a whole lot of different minorities, or even groups as large as just women. And if cultural relativism is true, then it was right to treat black people a certain way, or to treat women a certain way, or that white men are the only ones who really should have systemic levels of power. So that seems an odd sort of thing to say. If we can really have progress as a culture, and if we want to change things about our culture, cultural relativism seems to imply that that's just not the right way to look at things. Similarly, if cultural relativism is true, sorry, I think I've jumped ahead of us here. No, no. Uh, if we're looking at the same sort of points, uh, cultural relativism doesn't really do any better of a job at addressing moral disagreement. If we have two cultures that disagree about something, well, again, according to cultural relativism, both of those cultures are correct. If, say, one society says that slavery is horrible and morally wrong, and another society says that slavery is a okay, it's perfectly fine, it seems weird to say, like rationally weird and a little bit insane to say that both countries are correct, that slavery is both okay and not okay. So cultural relativism doesn't really avoid any of the issues that subjective relativism does, and it also adds in worries about the idea of moral progress. According to cultural relativism, societies can't really improve morally, they can only become different, because what they believe about morality is what's actually true about it. So, if you want to try and say and improve a society, then you need to be able to acknowledge that your society is mistaken in certain ways. You have to have some sort of a standard by which you're judging your own society. And most of us want to say that society has improved morally, at least in some regards. Take, say, the civil rights movement from the 1960s in the United States. We like to think that we've done a whole lot better with race relations since that time period. They're certainly not fixed and solved and perfect. We certainly still have a lot of issues today in our society, even in this one topic, in this one area. But surely we can say that we're doing better, morally speaking. And if cultural relativism is true, then because our culture is what determines what's right or wrong, it doesn't really make any sense to say that one culture is better than another one. There's no external standard by which to judge that. We simply have two different cultures. There's no way of saying one is more correct or better than the other. There's no reason to prefer one or the other, at least at the moral level. We may have personal preferences, but yeah. So, this sort of worry about moral progress, as well as the first two, these also count against moral relativism quite strongly. And so they might give us good reasons to reject it. Now, we don't have to agree with those. We shouldn't automatically say that cultural relativism is wrong, but it definitely has some significant objections to it. And these are things that relativists need to address. Now, a third option compared to all of this is to endorse some version of anti realism, something like emotivism, what the video I've asked you to take a look at calls subjective relativism, though the video is just wrong in this sort of case. Uh, Emotivism is a kind of anti realism. It denies that there's any sort of moral fact at all. And that's because, for emotivism, it argues that moral statements aren't the kinds of things that can be facts. They're not the kinds of things that can be true or false. So, as a result, there are no objective moral facts. There are no right answers to moral questions. And emotivism does this by basically explaining moral statements like X is good or X is right by saying that really what's happening when we say things like this is that we're saying really a very fancy form of yay X or I like X or you should do X. Basically, emotivism argues that moral statements and judgments are nothing more than expressions of emotion. They really are just fancy emotional signals that we give off to each other. And as a theory, this has a certain amount of appeal. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. We don't have any sort of mysterious standards and moral facts that we have to account for. And we don't have any sort of odd contradictions going on when we try and explain things like moral disagreement. But for all of its simplicity, emotivism also has some major issues. For one, it doesn't match up with our moral experience very well. Excuse me, long night. But it doesn't match up with our moral experiences very well. Emotivism uh, says that we don't actually describe anything about the world when we say something like stealing is wrong. Instead, we're basically saying boo stealing. But most of us want to say that when I say that stealing's wrong, when I say that sort of sentence and when I believe that kind of statement, that I am actually describing the world. I'm saying something about what stealing is like. I'm saying stealing is wrong. In fact, even the sentence grammatically is structured that way. And emotivism requires that every single one of us who thinks that way, that we're wrong. We're wrong about the very things that are coming out of our mouth and what we're trying to say and accomplish. And that just seems absolutely bonkers, to put it in a rather blunt sort of way. There are good things in favor of emotivism. There may be some solution to this kind of worry. But in a lot of ways, emotivism struggles as a theory. It doesn't match our moral experiences very well, and it doesn't have a good way of explaining moral disagreement in a different way than relativism. So relativism has a difficulty in saying what's happening when two people disagree about some moral problem or another. Emotivism has the issue of making it impossible for two people to disagree. If I say yay and you say boo, we don't really disagree about anything. We're making clashing noises and expressing clashing emotions. We certainly aren't saying the same thing. But we're not describing the world. We're not really disagreeing in a way that additional facts or observation or thoughts could resolve. We're just expressing our emotions and approval or disapproval about a given thing. And that doesn't seem quite right. Most of us intuitively think that when we talk about morality, we are actually saying something. We are actually describing the world. If emotivism's true, we're all mistaken about that. And that seems deeply, deeply unsettling and just unlikely in a lot of ways. It doesn't seem to be a very plausible picture of what's going on. It's not a very good explanation in a lot of ways. So, given these three main positions, objectivism, relativism, and emotivism, and other nihilist or not nihilist, anti-realist sort of positions, given that all of them have some sort of an issue, some sort of question that they struggle to answer, we might wonder what it is we can actually do. What should we do in order to move forward as a class with all of this? Because we need to discuss moral problems and we need to have some sort of an answer to them. So, as a working solution, just as a functional sort of thing, I'm going to be assuming that some version of objectivism is true for the rest of the semester. But I do admit that it is an open philosophical question. It's not a settled problem or matter at all. And so at the end of the day, you have to decide for yourself which position you think has the most rational support to it. That doesn't mean that your belief gets to change the fact of the matter of which one's true, but you can only believe in which one you think has the best reasons in favor of it. It's something that nobody can tell you is automatically right or wrong, and you be able to just perfectly believe them. It's the sort of thing you have to think about for yourself, at least a certain degree. So I certainly don't want to tell you that objectivism just automatically is true and the others are false. I think it has a less difficult time with its questions than the other topics do, than the other viewpoints do. But honestly, we really just need objectivism to be able to move forward with the class. We need to be able to assume that there is actually something we can learn about from moral problems, that there are actual answers to these things that we ought to be looking for. If we don't have that, it seems somewhat pointless to engage with some of this stuff. So, in order to move forward with the class, I'm going to assume that some kind of objectivism is true, but you certainly don't have to agree with me. It's my general policy to never grade you based on what you do believe about a given topic, but rather just the reasons that you have for your position. So I don't care what position you end up agreeing with at the end of the day. I just want you to be able to take a position and to defend it rationally. But that said, we do have other things to move on to. So, if you haven't already, take a look at your journal assignments and the quiz, as well as an additional video about meta ethics that adds a little bit of extra detail and maybe gives a couple of examples to help hit some of this info home. I quite enjoyed the speaker, I find him entertaining. And yeah, about wraps up our discussion of these things for the semester. So, good luck with your other stuff.